let's start with some topics. And
Yeah.
I think the first topic that kind of flooded my social media feeds this week was 30 years of PlayStation. It's hard to believe the PlayStation has been around for that long, and I figured I would ask you, what are some of your memories with the PlayStation 1?
Well, PlayStation 1 is one of my favorite consoles. I have two, which is PlayStation 1 and the Sega Dreamcast. Those are two of my favorite consoles of all time. With I didn't even know it's been around for 30 years. Sometimes I forget how fast time is moving. But for me, I've discovered a lot of genres that I play today through PlayStation 1. So I fell in love with tactics RPGs because of the PlayStation 1. A lot of people would assume that I'm probably talking about Final Fantasy Tactics, right? I mean, when you say
Absolutely.
tactics RPGs, it'll be Final Fantasy Tactics. For me, it wasn't Final Fantasy Tactics. It was a game called Vandal Hearts. I don't know if you ever heard of that.
I have heard of it. I have not played it. And it was one of those games that I was trying to hunt, but I think it's gotten quite expensive.
Oh, is it? I didn't even know it's expensive now. But Vandal Hearts is basically Konami's take on Final Fantasy Tactics. It has a more mature story. Well, I wouldn't say it has a more. They're both pretty mature, but I guess there's a death animation that kind of makes the game pretty graphic. So whenever you would kill an enemy on the field, instead of them just dying, or they fall on the floor in Final Fantasy Tactics, in this game, blood sprays out of their neck and it just sprays into the sky. And that's how you know you killed an enemy on the field. That was the first time I've ever encountered like a strategy RPG on the PS1, and it was all pixelated and stuff. And of course, you got your Vandal Hearts, but you also had your Final Fantasy Sevens, which was a Final Fantasy that I spent so much time and hours on. But actually, because I played that one, I had to play the other six that came before it. So I started looking back. Um, PS1 had a lot of gems, man. It had a lot of gems, but it also had those experimental games because everybody was experimenting with 3D. So I had games like Intelligent Cube or Jump and Flash, which was another good one that a lot of people don't remember. There was another game that was called Assault Rigs that I grew up with, where you drive tanks in like a kind of what's that movie called? Tron. Thank you. It looks like Tron. But yeah, I've had some very good memories with PlayStation One. Those huge long loading times, those were great. I don't know. How about you? Do you? I know. I'm sure you have plenty memories of the PlayStation One.
Yeah, so when I was getting all of this stuff, I was thinking about, like, when did I get it? What were my absolute very first memories with it? And I can't remember the year, but
Hmm.
I remember the circumstance. So I had a summer job that my mother got for me at like a kitchen supply store. I guess she knew the owner or something. And I absolutely hated this job. It was so boring. They had no customers, and I would just kind of walk up and down the aisles reading a book or something. It was just the worst way
Yeah,
that I could spend time
it's
as
a
a kid.
boring job. Yeah, I got you. I've had one of
Uh,
those.
yeah, and so after a while, I was just like, you know what, I hate this. So I called my friend, who was like the first person that I knew who had a license and who could drive, and I said, what was his name? I think his name was like James. I'm like, James, you know what? I need you to come pick me up at work. I'm just going to quit my job and buy a PlayStation. So I need you to pick me up, take me to, I think it was for those who live in the Northeast, I think it was the Wiz. I don't know if you,
Oh, I
because
never
you grew
grew up
up
with
in,
that, but I never grew up with the Wiz, but I know of the Wiz.
yeah. So I'm like, I need you to drive me to the Wiz. I was making this guy to be like my personal Uber driver before Uber existed. So like, I need you to pick me up, take me to the Wiz. I've saved up enough money. I'm buying a PlayStation. I'm quitting my job. And so he did. I picked up. I only had enough money for this console. Did it come with a memory card or not? Now I can't
No,
remember.
you had to buy that separate.
All right, so I got the console, the memory card, and 2 games. One was, I think it was Cool Borders 2.
Okay, if you got Cool Borders too, that means you got the console pretty late.
That was
Like
late?
that was a bit late. That was about 2 years after the console was out, or about maybe a year and a half.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that was the case because I mean, it wasn't in '95. Definitely wasn't in '95.
Yeah.
And then I got the WWF Raw is War game, which
Oh
was
man.
relatively like it was a new release.
Hmm.
And those were the 2 games I played for the rest of the summer. And I was kind of surprised because my parents weren't particularly angry. Like I figured, oh man, I'm going to get hammered for this. Quit the
Right.
job and buy a PlayStation. So I played those 2 games for a bit, and then I remember getting Final Fantasy VII shortly after it was released, because I think it was released in '97.
Yeah, 97.
Now I can't remember when in '97, but it wasn't like the first week, because the way I discovered it was a couple of guys at lunch where every day at lunch they were talking about what they had experienced last night in Final Fantasy VII. And of course I knew about Final Fantasy from the NES, but it had kind of, and Super NES, but it had faded into the background for me.
Yeah.
And then I was like, you know what, this sounds awesome. So I probably got it maybe a month after it released. And that just was one of the greatest gaming experiences that I've ever had. Just playing through that whole game, the sense of discovery. I think we talked about it before. Like,
Yeah, we did.
when I got past the Midgar part, I thought,
Yeah, it was over.
yeah, I thought I had beat the game. And then when that world opened up, it was
Yeah.
just like, oh wow, this is what new video gaming is about in the 32-bit era.
Yeah.
So,
That
and then the other thing I think that stands out for me with the original PlayStation, starting with Final Fantasy VII, but also in a lot of other games, was that art style where you had like a pre-rendered background
yeah.
with your character running through it. So games like Parasite Eve, I don't know if you,
Resident Evil.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and I felt like that to me is an art style that was born on the PS1
Mm-hmm.
and pretty much stayed there. Like you didn't see too much of that on the PS2 because they could kind of like actively render the whole
I don't
world.
think you've seen any of it on the PS2. I don't remember any games on the PS2 having pre-rendered backgrounds.
Yeah, or any game since, really.
Yeah, no. And that's a cool looking art style too, to put a 3D polygon figure and a pre-rendered background. That's a neat way to go about game design.
I think there's a new game that came out. I saw it pop up briefly on the Happy Console Gamer channel. I can't recall the name, but it was like a throwback to that style. But yeah, so to me that is what the PS1 represents, and also, as you said, the creativity, like where companies were just trying new things.
Yeah.
And I mean, like games like Ehrgeiz and Einhänder, like
Einhänder was a good one, and
yeah,
there was another one that was really good. It was a 3D platformer called Pandemonium. That was pretty good. Yeah, that took creativity. That was doing the whole 2D, 3D thing. That was great times, man. Those are awesome. The way I got my PlayStation, I don't think I was old enough to have a job yet, and I'm not trying to throw your age out there. I don't want you to think that.
No. Let's be honest. I'm old.
But I didn't have a job at the time, but I always got an allowance from my grandmother and my parents, and I had to save up money. And I remember going to a store at the time called Service Merchandise, and seeing the PlayStation for the first time. And I told my mom, I was like, I really want that. Can we get that? And she told me, she's like, look, if you save up half, I'll put up the other half, and we'll get you a PlayStation. Eventually, I did, and I saved up half, got the PlayStation from Service Merchandise. Or it was probably Macy's. This is when they were actually selling electronics at the time, because they don't do that anymore. And I took it home, and I realized I didn't have any games. I just had a demo disc, and I played the hell out of that demo disc. But it also got me to look up games that I didn't know existed. So I went to Blockbuster right after and rented Fighting Force, and I think it was either Tekken 2 or Tomba. It was one of those two, because I remember having Tomba for a little bit and playing Tekken a lot. And I played the heck out of those games. And I remember playing Fighting Force and being a bit disappointed, but still loving it, because it basically felt like a 3D version of Final Fight to me with Tekken speed. It was just fast but bad at the same time. And I just remember playing those games so much. And just like you, I remember going to school and all my I wouldn't say it was all my friends. It was one friend that I had at the time that would talk about Final Fantasy VII. He was like, "Oh, I'm playing Final Fantasy VII. It's so amazing. It's so awesome, and you have to try it out." And I remember I'm gonna bring up some old stores because I already brought up Surface merchandise, and that kind of shows my age too. I remember I went to a place. Do you remember a place called Comp USA?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I went into a Comp USA and they had Final Fantasy VII for $20. So I bought Final Fantasy VII. I started playing it, and I remember being very confused by the game because I think Final Fantasy VII was my very first RPG. I know it's not, but I think it's the RPG that I actually spent time playing. And I remember playing it and being very confused, like, why am I running down hallways and this weird thing happens where you end up in this battle and you can't move around, and why do I have to fight through menus? Because I was very confused by this, but for some reason the story was so good, I just kept playing the game. And I remember a friend of mine, he didn't have money to get the game, so I let him borrow it. And I'm an only child, so I only have myself to play the game. And I remember him, his brother, and his sister. They had my game for about a week. And when he brought over his memory card to my house, him and his brother and sister had like, I think they used up the whole memory card because they had different save slots for different levels. And in each different level, they have made it to like bosses I've never seen yet, because I haven't gotten that far. And they had it for a week, and I had it for maybe about a month or so. And I remember this was the first time I saw Diamond Weapon, and I was like, "Oh my god, this game is amazing! I have to get here." So and he would just tell me, "Oh man, wait till you get to this part," or, "Oh, did you get to this part about Aerith?" And I was like, "What? What happens to her?" It was great. It was a cool time. This was the time where you didn't click on things on the internet and got stories. Like, you and your friends had experiences, and then you shared them with one another. I miss those times.
Yeah. I it's funny you're talking about that story. So I had kind of a similar thing. I had played it, beat it, and I was like the biggest proponent of this game. And I had a friend, and I think he had gotten a PlayStation, but he wasn't, I don't know, he wasn't thrilled with it. He wasn't really a gamer. And I'm like, "Listen, I'm going to lend you this game, and it's going to completely change your mind." And so I had a sleepover, at his house, and I was sitting there with him and his sister, and I'm like, "All right, you're going to put this in." And I was like training them. I'm like, "All right, go here, do this, wait till you see this part." And he was kind of an intellectual guy, so I'm like, we were discussing the ethics of environmental terrorism and
Right.
stuff like that. And so like we had this amazing time, and he was like, "Oh, can I borrow the game?" And then it's just like a week or two later, I was over there, and same thing. They had explored every last like possible thing you could do in Final Fantasy VII, and I had converted them, and I was so proud of myself. A couple of other things that come to mind. I think this is where being old gives you some perspective.
Yeah.
Sony, at that time, obviously the idea that they were getting into gaming was so unique because they were that high-end electronics company.
Yeah.
And the idea that they were going to somehow compete with Nintendo and
Sega,
was exciting. And the best thing I could do as a comparison is like, imagine if Apple came out right now. They're the sleek, popular, electronics company, higher end stuff, and they're like, you know what? We're going to compete with the PlayStation 5, and we're going to come out with this amazing Apple game system.
Yeah.
And so you thought of them in one way, and you had this really high opinion, like, oh, Sony receivers and CD players. And it was like, wow, they're giving us kids a Sony CD player that can play games. Like, there was
Yeah.
a certain cachet to that was unique. It's like, oh, yeah, Nintendo only makes games, but Sony makes everything. And now they're taking that expertise and that knowledge, and they're concentrating it into this little box made just for me. Again, that's how I thought about it. It was, maybe kind of silly. The other thing that kind of stands out when you go back and you look at those times and you return to those games, I think you also have to point out that PlayStation 1 has not aged well visually.
Um.
And
Yeah.
I think on a lot of those games, like those 3D games where back then you were blown away, I'll give you two examples. The original Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah.
Like, I played that years later, and I'm like, ooh, wow, my memory had it so clear and crisp and awesome, and it's kind of a blurry mess. It's like when you think back to N64 and PlayStation 1, like, and you go back and play them, you have the N64 fog versus
Yeah.
the Sony pixels, and even if you throw it up through an upscaler and stuff like that, it to me it just doesn't translate well to today.
I'm gonna be honest. I kind of disagree in a way.
Okay.
With N64, I do agree though, because I feel like there's that I don't know. It feels like someone smeared Vaseline over your eyes.
Yes.
Get that. It's horrible. I hate that. But I remember a couple months ago, me and my friends put up a video of my friend playing a Metal Gear Solid, and I remember watching Metal Gear Solid, and I was looking, I was like, it's pixelated, and the characters have to move their heads, but to me it still looked visually good. That might be the nostalgia talking, but I still think that there's some games on the PlayStation 1, even if you don't have the upscaler, it still looks good. Metal Gear Solid is one of them. I like the way Metal Gear Solid looked. I liked all the tricks that they had to use in order to make it look visually appealing. Even like the underwater effects was pretty cool, because it wasn't really underwater. You can really tell that they just slowed your character down and then they put like this weird wavy effect. But it was still cool. Another game that I think is visually like appealing to the eyes on the PlayStation 1 is Legend of Mana. I recently popped that in, and I was like, man, this looks like an old Nick Jr. cartoon. This is like really cool. It's a really cool looking game with an artistic value that hasn't been replicated yet. Like, have you ever played Legend of Mana?
I have not.
Oh, okay. There's a scene in Legend of Mana. It's super early on, like as soon as you start the game. If you go outside of the character's house and you just run down, I guess, the right path, you can go behind the house. And behind the house, there's a giant tree that has a face. And the motion, I think they used full motion video on it, but they blended it with the pre-rendered background that we were talking about, and it just looks beautiful. It looks great, and I think that there's certain games that just don't look good. Like I popped in, what was it, Twisted Metal not too long ago just to play it, and I was like, oh man, you get that grainy effect on the outside of objects. I would definitely agree. Games like that, but there's other games that really have I guess it's a trick that I also use when I'm doing illustrations. A lot of the times when you bring up the whole I didn't remember my brain, seeing the picture like this. A lot of the times our imagination fills in the gaps. I use this exact trick when I'm illustrating comic books. Sometimes I never fully draw in anything because I allow the reader to fill in the gaps, and it makes it fun for their brain. I think PlayStation 1 did that trick a lot. It did it immensely. But I do feel like, I don't think that the PlayStation 1 aged poorly. I think that there's some games that aged poorly. If you pop in Pandemonium now, Pandemonium is still fun. It still looks good. And games like I'm trying to remember that not Tomba, the Castlevania one, Symphony of the
Symphony of
Night.
yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, like, because the sprite based art,
yeah,
just generally, I think ages well.
yeah.
Um,
But 3D art, I 3D art, I still think it depends on the game because there's a game on PlayStation 1 that I love to play. I pop it in at least once a month, maybe 2 times a month, and I play it. Like Jet Moto. Jet Moto, I would. It does have that same grainy effect. It does have like this weird 3D pixelated look to it, but the game is still looks good because it has colorful levels, it has really cool tracks. It moves in a certain way where you're still having this awesome great roller coaster ride with it. But I will definitely say like some of the HD remasters of today have definitely made us look back at other stuff and say, "Oh my god, this looks horrible." You know?
yeah, yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm just trying to think of like good ones. Like my second bad example was going to be Mega Man Legends, which
Oh,
kind of looks good when you're not
yeah.
moving around too much, but then when you do move around, you have some of the effects that you're talking about. Plus, the controls. This was before the dual stick
It was thick, yeah.
times,
So
and it's hard to.
you had to use the shoulder buttons to turn around.
Yeah, so
Yeah, yeah.
you maneuver through the world. Um,
Good
so
times.
but I think a couple good examples would be. I always thought Brave Fencer Musashi looked good. I don't know if you ever.
I actually played that recently. I have a copy. It has some rough spots, but it still looks great. You know, it's
Yeah,
still yeah. I've played Brace Fencer.
and Rival Schools. I
I
think
love
that
Rival
looks
Schools.
awesome on the PlayStation One.
See, I think a game like Rival Schools looks a bit rough, but the backgrounds really save it. You know, Rival Schools and what is it? Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha
Yep.
is another one that also uses pre-rendered backgrounds.
Yeah, now that you mention it does. I mean, what do you think of like Tekken? Like I always thought Tekken 3 was held up
Yeah,
decently.
yeah. Tekken 3 looks good. What was it? Tekken 3, Tekken 2, and then you had what was the other one? Bloody Roar is another one.
That
That
one
was
I've
pretty.
never played.
That one has kind of the film grainy thing that you're talking about, like the pixelation on the outside of every, like a character doesn't move and you can see the lines moving on the outside of the characters. Yeah, I don't know. I think it just really depends on. I think it just depends on what you like. See, I like that stuff. But I've come to know things about you is that you like visual fidelity and high frame rates.
I do like high frame rates. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean the graphics can kind of be average, but I do need that crisp, clear frame rate.
Yeah. I when we get later down the road, I actually have something. I finally see where you're coming from when it comes to frame rate. I've gotten a game and it destroyed me when it started doing things I didn't like.
Nice, but I mean I don't mean to like trash the PlayStation because I think so much of it is period specific and it is nostalgic, and I
Yeah.
would say that. I mean, to me, I'll just reiterate it again. It's the pre-rendered background with the 3D animated character, like Final Fantasy VII Parasite Eve. Like, I think that holds up. That
Yeah. Yes, it does.
comes back, and you're like, okay, that is PlayStation. And so,
Yeah.